Hi everyone. Nevertheless, I managed to finish the third part till the end of April. While working on Buggy, I happened to run into many mistakes and deadlock issues that I successfully overcame. Now I'll tell you everything on the order. I started my work with a steering gear. I bought a steering rack, I attached it to the frame and realized that it didn't fit in size and stuck out by edges, so it needed to be shortened, cut into sections, and then welded into a new steering rack. I already had a steering gear which didn't fit in size to the project. At that moment, it turned me upset, but now I understand that it helped me to save a few days. Further, you'll know why this kind of gear didn't fit in such a project, and also such suspension. First, I fully demounted the steering rack. Of course, I don't have any special wrench for the rack dismantling, so I carved it from a bolt. Then, using a screwdriver and a hammer, I carefully unscrew the gear nut, and using a lever from the wrench, I unscrew a pinion gear group together with a bearing. Now you can easily pull out a toothed rack. I wiped it from lubrication and began to saw. I sawed off the toothed rack and cut off attaching points of steering wires from the rod, which later would be welded to the edges of the toothed rack. I made it for the first time and decided not to use continuous welding at once. Somehow I suggested that I could be wrong. Now it's time for casing of the steering gear. I left 5 centimeters from each size of the casing from the central part in which I would press the bushings from a polypropylene tube. They are needed to remove a backlash of the steering rack. I bored the inner diameter by handmade drill, which I made from the remains of the rod by welding a bolt to it and making spiral notchings. I sharpened a little the outer diameter with a grinding machine, and all the excess from the bushing was cut by the casing. I got reinsured and put the bushings on several screws. I welded a pipe to the frame on which the modified rack will be attached. I made a deepening in the pipe for the ledge on the casing of the steering rack. The rack will be attached on the supports made from pipe. The steering gear will be pressed by staples from the thread studs. For their fastening, I cut a couple of details from the angle in which I drilled the holes for stud. I tightened everything with screws and welded angles to the pipe. I decided to use native steering wires. I sawed off a part from them and welded again, the same way I re-welded the tie rod end. I cut off the native one and welded classic under the swivel member. In order to stiffen the steering rack, we need to fasten a bar between the bolts, for example, from the angle. I sawed off a steering drop arm and began to set the Ackerman angle, which is needed for a proper wheel rotation. But first, I shortened the steering drop arm on 3 centimeters to decrease the steering rotation. I pulled the rope from the center of the rearmost axle in the direction of the front ball caster. The hole center in the drop arm should pass along the rope. This would let the wheels rotate in the right direction. The outer wheel would have a larger radius during the turning rather than an inner one. I was nearly ready to move on to the shock absorber struts when I met the problem with spontaneous wheel rotation of the wheel while suspension working. I always made a static suspension as in kart and radio control car and have never dealt with a double fishbone suspension. That was the point of the problem. I began to Google information and found out that the steering wire joint should be on the one axle with a silent block of the lower arm. The traction should also be parallel to the lower arm. I was also distracted by the fact that the steering rack's traction went practically from one point. I lengthened the rack with a pipe and the wheels stopped to wobble. Then there was a week of testing, but finally I made one certain decision. The point is that the steering rack would be located also from the front but as low as possible. For this purpose, I cut off a part of the pipe which interfered with the lower location of the rack and welded a rod with a timbering for the steering gear. I refused the native steering wires and bought the cheapest ones from Renault model. I sawed off the earlier welded rods from the rack and made some threads in them. I couldn't find a tap for a steering wire which had a screw pitch 1 cm and cut an ordinary one with a screw pitch 1.25 cm. Under the pipe which I would lengthen to toothed bar, I made a groove. As I didn't find a tap, we should also change a thread on the steering wire for M10 with a screw pitch 1.25 cm. I thinned off an old thread, refined with a rasp, and cut a new one. I screwed the earlier made detail to the wire and measured the length of a spacer which was made from the pipe. This time I didn't dismantle the steering rack and welded everything by step with intermediate cooling of the metal. And if I knew this would happen in advance, I would rather use another model rack, but maybe I would also have to remodel it. That's what complicates such projects. You need to fit all details under the size of 3D models from the game with preservation of all proportions. It was sad to saw off the steering drop arm again, but we need to straighten it and weld a bit lower to the steering knuckle until the parallel position of the wire and a lever. I heated the drop arm by welding and straightened with a maul. I had no tie rod ends to re-weld a thread from them, and I made a temporary decision from the pipe and a couple of nuts. While welding such things, you must always cool the tie rod end, otherwise it can melt and there will be a backlash. I screwed the tip to the wire, adjusted the radius, and checked in. The result quite satisfied me. At last, the steering knuckle stopped wobbling during the suspension movement. You can also add a couple of bushings on the rod in order to exclude the load on the toothed bar. I finally moved to the springs and shock absorbers. I began working with the front shock absorbers. We need to make cups for them in which the spring would abut. The upper cup would be fastened on the rod through the spacer from a circle of 20 mm. I made a thread in it. Managed to drill a hole in the circle, not from the first time. I welded the ring for the bushing from the back shock absorber. I sawed off a circle for the cup from the pipe which inner diameter was 100 mm. I blocked it with a slab from one side in which I drilled a hole for an earlier prepared circle. I took the junction from pipe of 25 mm to 42 mm and welded it to the cup and circle. That gave the upper cup a more complete look as in the original. For the lower cup, I made a bushing from the pipe. A bit increased its diameter so it could fit the shock absorber. I welded a couple of ears to it and welded this construction to the cup. I didn't weld the lower cup to the absorber as there was a risk to burn the metal and you would have to re-weld a cup at every replacement. You can also make a bushing from a sanitary long screw with a thread, and it will be possible to regulate absorber's rigidity. Here you can see how much the spring is compressed in the shock absorber strut. I welded a pipe to the lower level for the strut timbering, and for the upper timbering I welded a spacer. I was welding in place with already put on U-shaped brackets. For the unloaded front suspension, it seemed a bit rigid to me. We'll see as it will work while driving. More likely, we'll need to put some weight on the front. I took the rear struts and tried them on the frame. I got heated with them a little as they didn't fit in place at all. I pondered on and decided to put the same shock absorbers as on the front struts, but only with a forceful spring. I'd need only the lower cup from those struts. I accurately sawed it off, saving working capacity of the shock absorber. As for the front struts, I also made a bushing for a cup. The spring became bigger and the pipe diameter for a cup should be enlarged. The circle would be longer than on the front struts because of a longer spring. I assembled everything together, and now we've got a rear shock absorber strut. I welded the bracket timbering to the frame for the upper silent block. The lower timbering I welded to one of the lever tubes and strengthened it with a slab. I put on the wheel and tried the rear suspension on stiffness. As I expected, the rear suspension turned out to contain a lot of rigidity in stock. It will also be regulated while working with Buggy. And that's all for today. Give your thumbs up and subscribe on the channel. It'll speed up issue of the next part.